Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links video. Today what we thought we'd do is make another tier list, but this tier list is going to be a little bit special because we have got the dates for the upcoming WCS 2024 qualifiers for Rush Duels. So what this means is we will have a week to complete stage 1, which should be pretty free for the most part, and then we will have a 3-day weekend, at the end of which the top 2 players from each region will receive an invitation to the Rush Duel Links World Championship, which is very, very exciting. So what we thought we'd do is we'd go through a lot of the decks so we can kind of give you an idea of what you might want to be playing during the first and second stages. So the Rush Duel first stage will begin on June 3rd and the second stage will begin on June 7th. Note that you don't have to get to the second stage by June 7th to take part. You can go all the way up until the end if you just want to get the rewards, for example. But if you can get there by June 7th, you have your kind of best chance at trying to get that top 100 or that coveted world invite. So the next thing we want to take a look at is some of the raw data. So before you, we have all of the tournament results from every tournament that's taken place since the release of Steel Kaleido Mirror, which is the latest mini box. Steel Kaleido Mirror was quite a pivotal box as it did introduce Steel Mechlord Mirror Innovator, which as we can see has skyrocketed machines to being the strongest deck in the game. Taking a look at our first place results, we can see that Machine has won 5 times. And if we head over to our table, we can see that Machines by far are winning the most events with 5 tournament wins, the next highest being a 3-way tie at only 1 win apiece. And as you can see by our pie charts, Machines are taking up rather large chunks of both of them, with one being about a third and the other one being almost half. So Machines are definitely the most powerful deck. Going by tournament wins, we would then say that Cyburst, Noodle Ninjas and Aggro are the next best, and then again by top 4 results it would then be Harpies, Royal Rebels, SAR and Overlord, and then finally Blue Eyes and Psychic are the last kind of topping decks. So that's what the raw data is telling us. But again, this isn't always going to be a one-to-one of just what exactly the meta is, and we'll get into the little bit of nitty-gritty of each of these decks and why we would recommend some of them and not recommend others as we get into the actual tier list itself. First off, I think this goes without saying that we're going to be putting the Machines, and more specifically Mirror Innovator, into tier 1. I think it's hard to argue against Machine being the best deck in the game right now. I mean, just looking at the results, it has 5 tournament wins, which is 5 times as many wins as any other deck. The deck is very, very powerful, it's very, very versatile. But the deck does have one major weakness, and that is if you don't see your Mirror Innovators for whatever reason, the deck feels rather lackluster. The deck is basically Mirror Innovator and Friends, because Mirror Innovator does all of the heavy lifting for this deck. So Mirror Innovator is a 2400 attack monster that lets you shuffle cards from your graveyard that are the same type as it, so that'll be Machines, and then it will gain attack equal to the level of the monster shuffle back times 100. So you can shuffle between 1 and 3 cards, so the maximum this is generally going to hit is if we shuffle back 3 level 7s, we'll gain 2100 attack, jump up to 4500. That's a really good number because that means we can attack over maximum monsters without weakening them first with something like a Talismanic Seal Array. On top of the fact, if we only shuffle back 1 card, we gain Piercing, which is fantastic because the thing we keep saying is your deck needs a way to beat set 3 pass, and Piercing is one of the best ways to do so. This deck is very flexible because, again, we don't have to run the TSAs, we don't have to run anything like a Pierce or a Stop Defense to get to our opponent's life points, as well as the fact that we can also just sit on Mirror Innovator and a couple of defense mode monsters to play around our opponent having a very aggro-centric or something like Royal Rebels that can blow up our entire board, and just basically keep piercing every turn, and basically just play like a control style game and just slowly chip away at our opponent, which this deck does quite well. On top of that, the primary skill used with this deck is Ultimate Bond, which can help unbrick you, and I think is the primary use of this skill. Basically, people tend to play around 7 high-level monsters in this deck, and that is because using our skill, we can reveal one of those 2500 attack monsters, so notably not Mirror Innovator. Then we can take another card from our hand, or the card we revealed, shuffle it back into our deck, and trade it out for an Aim Eagle, which we can then either use for its effect, or we can just use it as tribute fodder, so we can basically unbrick our hand quite a lot with it, as well as the fact the skill can also just boost something's attack by 1000, which is very good. If we use on Mirror Innovator, it immediately goes up to 3400, who can then gain more attack and piercing if we want to, so easily this card can get up to 4100 attack and piercing, which can close out games quite drastically. Very, very powerful. But we can also just boost one of our 2500 other machine monsters up to a 3500 and clear an opposing 2500, for example, which is also very, very strong, as well as the fact that Barrel Dragon is a machine, so it also works perfectly in here, and it does work with the skill, which is fantastic. And on top of all of that, this is also one of the best decks in the game for abusing Essel, and Essel is absolutely fantastic right now, specifically if we can make good use of the monsters that we summon on turn 2. So the best targets for this are going to be Mirror Innovator and Dragius, and the reason for that is Mirror Innovator can pierce through your opponent's set 3 opening, and Dragius can attack through them as well and get a direct attack in for 2500. So any of these monsters that can get damage in through set 3 pass on turn 2 off of the Essel are always going to be fantastic, and this is one of the best decks for Essel anyway, because the deck does revolve around getting a lot of cards in the graveyard to fulfill the effect requirements of Mirror Innovator as well as Surge Bicorn, which both require you to shuffle a lot of cards from your graveyard back into the deck. So the next deck we want to talk about is Noodle Ninjas. So we have two different Noodle Ninjas here. We do have the Spice and the Extra Spice variant. I would say that the Spice version of this deck, which is basically the kind of OTK super hyper aggressive deck. This is the Noodle Art of Roastery, summon out multiple spice, use the effect, get 3 monsters with these ridiculous attack values of like 4000 plus, and try and attack through your opponent. That version of the deck is down in high road. This one up here, this is the Extra Spice version, which is the slower, trap-oriented, control, burn style Noodle Ninja list. This deck is very, very powerful. You're able to basically stave off defeat by just using your myriad of trap cards to protect you as you slowly burn through your opponent. As well as the fact that with the skill we got, the Noodle Art Reboot, it does make this deck extraordinarily powerful. Basically, every time that we summon out one of our boss monsters, we can get an extra body from our graveyard back to our hand. And we can give one of those boss monsters an extra 600 attack. So first off, just that 600 attack is fantastic. That means Extra Spice can easily hit 3000, which is generally enough to hit over anything that isn't a maximum monster, which is very good, because it also means that when we do attack our opponent's attack position monsters, we will get in for a chunk of damage, which all does add up, especially when you consider the burn damage that we'll get on top by Extra Spice. Getting that extra body, though, is extremely important, because we can use it as fodder to use Extra Spice's effect to burn our opponent for 1000 and draw the card, but also we can just use it to set a monster and just have it on the field, or use it as tribute fodder. So a very, very versatile skill, very, very powerful. But the main reason this deck is so powerful is it doesn't rely on any of the limit 3 cards for the deck to function, which means we can use some of those generic, very, very powerful limit 3 cards in this list to great effect, such as Call of the Earthbound and King's Majesty, which just gives us this such powerful trap lineup that other decks just are basically not allowed to use. On top of the fact that by using cards like Talismanic Sealer to be able to shuffle cards back into our deck, and using cards like Monster Reborn to be able to recycle our boss monsters back, we are sometimes able to get massive burn turns of perhaps 3000 plus damage in a single turn, just by recycling Extra Spice again and again and again, keep sending monsters to the grave, and keep burning our opponent for 1000 each and every time, which is really, really powerful. This deck I think is really slept on by a lot of people, but it is one of the best. The next deck we want to talk about is Aggro. So Aggro is a deck that has been around since the dawn of Rush. Basically, it's the good stuff pile deck. It's just Dragius put in with a bunch of 1500 beaters, some of the best spells and traps and monsters, all slapped together. The skill doesn't really matter. Basically, you're playing the best generic skill you can find, which so far typically has been Hammer Crush Deal, because just having generic back row removal is generally quite good, as well as the draw is oftentimes quite nice. It's basically like playing a 29 card deck, which is reasonably good. Dragius is always going to be a fantastic card. Even when it does eventually fall off, it will still be good. It just won't be amazing. Being able to attack twice and have one of those attacks be a direct attack is absolutely incredible, especially for the low cost of milling a card, which most decks want to be milling cards anyway. Being able to play all these 1500 attackers is also really, really nice, because a lot of decks can play some 1500s but can't necessarily play a lot of them. And that does mean that when a deck has a monster that has a really good effect but a few less attack points, let's say 1400 attack, let's say 1200 attack, you just can't clear the 15s with those monsters. So it is just annoying to play against, I suppose, in a lot of ways. On top of the fact, it is a deck that makes fantastic use of, once again, Essel. Being able to bring back a Dragius on turn 2 is absolutely ridiculous and can sometimes just really spell the end of a game immediately before it's even gotten started. So Essel, I think, is actually going to be one of the most important cards in the game going into this World Championship qualifier. So the next deck we want to talk about is a bit of a weird one, and that is Cyburst. Cyburst is a deck that has consistently been doing okay. It's a deck that pretty much since it came out has been doing fine. It hasn't really done anything particularly standout. It's always kind of been there. It's been like a low tier 3 deck through most of its life. But with the shift in the meta and the introduction of Chaos Femtron, this deck has had some life breathed into it and is now probably the second highest performing deck at the moment, which I think is partially due to its popularity. So Cyberse is a bit of a weird deck. A lot of the monsters in this deck have really low defense values, being at 100 or 0, which does act as a little bit of a liability, but a lot of the cards that really punish these low defense stats have kind of fallen out of the meta. With the introduction of both Negate Attack and Slime, we have basically found that people have stopped running Shield and Sword for the most part, and Shield and Sword was the harshest way to punish a deck that has low defense boss monsters. So with that kind of gone, it's meant that Cyberse have lost the main punish that they've always kind of had to deal with, which is really good for them. On top of the fact that because of, again, Slime and Negate Attack, we started to see a drop off in the amount of people playing Overlord, and Overlord has typically been quite a good counter to this list. And people have also started running less TSA for a similar reason. In general, players are less likely to play cards like Shield and Sword and Talismanic Sealer at the moment, because if your opponent has a Negate Attack, effectively both of those spells become worthless. You can activate them, summon out your monster, go to attack, your opponent flips over Negate Attack, and not only does your attack not work, but you've also just wasted your Talismanic Sealer Ray or your Shield and Sword, which is rather bad feeling, I suppose, which is why a lot of people have started leaning away from those cards. And once again, that means Yugioh gets to reign supreme. If a deck doesn't have a convincing out to the Yugioh, it can mean just the end of the game as soon as it hits the board. Now, talking about that, again, we already mentioned that Mirror Innovator has a very good way to just get over that 4000 attack threshold. So machines are quite a good out to the Yugioh itself. The issue is, if you're able to summon Yugioh fast enough, the machines can't get set up and get all their machines into the graveyard they need to be able to shuffle back for Mirror Innovator's effect, which means they also can just lose that race. Noodles are another one where Noodles don't have a really good out to Yugioh, but they tend to instead play around it. They're like, oh, I'm going to use my trap cards to try and stop you from killing me using Call of the Earthbound, using King's Majesty, using Negate Attack, and then I'm going to just try and burn you to death before you can get through all of my trap cards using Extra Spice. And aggro basically has to rely on Tribute to the Doomed as its legend, and then hope that TSA lands and that you're able to get those attacks in to deal with the Yugioh. So all of these decks can deal with Yugioh, especially since aggro will be on typically 2 to 3 TSA, just because that's how the deck generally works. But it's still very, very powerful. And even if you don't find the Yugioh, Atrashoot Hydron is still a very, very powerful boss monster that can still just kind of steal games out of nowhere. So Cyberse, often underestimated, is actually doing quite well right now. So the next step we want to talk about is Royal Rebels. So Royal Rebels is still a good deck, but it has started to see a bit of a decline in playability. And I think a big reason for that is it has an awkward matchup into some of the decks currently above it. So you could make the argument that Royal Rebels are really good at punishing something like machines that go wide, or aggro, which does need to build a huge board, or even something like the Cyberse, which again will either leave their big boss monster kind of as a sitting duck for Doom Metal, or again will go kind of wide and try and bash through. But outside of exactly Doom Metal, not a lot of the rest of this deck really is finding itself in a good spot for the current meta. And what we mean by that is, against machines, the machine player can opt to just sit on one copy of Innovator, play their other monsters in defense, and play basically under Doom Metal the entire time, and just out-damage your opponent through that, which can get awkward, because as soon as your opponent uses something like a Doom Metal or a Heavy Metal to just pop the one face-up Innovator, your opponent can then just hold their trap cards for that moment, and then use their traps to protect them, and then reset up an Innovator play again, and just keep doing that again and again, basically, because Innovator can infinitely shuffle other copies of Innovator back into your deck. So it kind of loses out in that matchup if it's played correctly by the machine player. And the Noodles have a fantastic matchup into the Royal Rebels. Noodles should almost never lose to Royal Rebels just because Noodles are quite comfortable again, just playing one monster face up, having everything else be face down, and burning your opponent to death slowly over the course of the game, whilst your opponent is unable to get any damage in against you. Aggro is a bit of a coin flip, I tend to find, because aggro, if they play aggressive enough and if they see the Dragiuses early enough, can just overrun the Royal Rebels, But on paper, I feel like Royal Rebels should have quite a good matchup into the aggro list, because aggro doesn't really have the ability to play under Doom Metal. You have to kind of play into it every single time, because if you're not summoning out 3 monsters and attacking as much as possible, you're not really playing aggro. And it's the only real way that they have to get damage in. And then finally, Cyburst is in a bit of a weird spot as well, because on Cyburst, if you are able to summon the maximum, sure, Doom Metal can out it, but if your opponent doesn't find their Doom Metal and they get stuck on Invasion and Heavy Metal, they still, again, have no out to the Yugioh, which can get a bit awkward. And even if they do manage to out the Yugioh, if they have their trap cards to protect them, they can just summon another one a following turn, which means your opponent has to continuously keep finding more and more outs to it, which means it can get a bit of a coin flip in this matchup. I would say that Cyburst, though, does tend to have a slight edge there. So I do think Royal Rebels are still good. Being able to pop your opponent's entire board is still very, very powerful. Being able to use Heavy Metal to pop something and get a massive load of attack is still very strong. And we have seen a piercing / stop defense variant of this deck, which has made it a lot stronger, especially since you can use stop defense on your opponent's face down monsters that they're trying to protect, flip them up, and then just pop them with the Doom Metal, which will then allow you to attempt to get more direct attacks, which can close out the game. Next up, we have Magnum Overlord. So Overlord is in a weird spot. With the introduction of Negate Attack, now every single deck has the capability to stop an attack from this boss monster, which has meant its popularity seems to have decreased quite a lot. I think a lot of people are kind of now in a situation where they're like, well, if my card is not going to guarantee end the game, I don't really want to be playing it. Now, there were some decks already, such as the Noodles, which were already playing things like King's Majesty and Earthbound to just stop the Magnum Overlord from being able to OTK. But now that every deck basically gets to play a Negate Attack, which is basically like every deck having a copy of King's Majesty, it's meant that Overlord has started to see a sharp decline in representation. It's still a very powerful deck, it can still do quite well, but if the maximum isn't going to just end the game, a lot of the time it does just feel like a worse version of 7's Axel Road, which does make it feel a little bit weaker than it had done previously. The next deck we want to talk about is Blue Eyes White Dragon. Now, Blue Eyes White Dragon is in a good spot at the moment, I think. Basically, this deck has been called Brick Eyes Cope Dragon because you have to run 7 high-level monsters basically to make this deck work. Now, what I have seen some players do is they've started to jam in as many different engines as possible that can just plus you cards, so that you can try and unbrick your hand by just having as much tribute material as physically possible, and I have seen some people get good results by doing things like that. Outside of doing exactly that, it becomes a bit of a coin toss as to whether or not you're going to draw a hand that's completely unplayable, or a hand that is unbelievably strong and really hard for your opponent to beat. This deck does have access to 2500 attack, 2500 defense monsters that can also boost their own attack by an additional 500 up to 3000, which is really, really strong. As well as the fact the skill gives you easy access to those bosses, and you can cheat them out onto the field or from the graveyard, which again is really, really good. The downside to this deck is that it can sometimes struggle to get through set 3 pass. We have seen people put Torna into their deck to basically try and circumvent this weakness, but it is not foolproof. There are still some situations where this deck can just kind of brick, and there's not really a lot you can do about it, but this deck does have some good matchups when not bricking. I would say this deck has quite nice matchups into things like aggro. I think it's got an okay matchup into Cyburst. I think it also has an okay matchup into machines. The only problem is I think it has a horrendous matchup into Noodles. I think realistically it doesn't play around Royal Rebels particularly well. This is another one of those decks that is going to more than likely have to commit 3 attack position monsters, and Doom Metal will just those monsters up. So although I think Blue Eyes is in an okay spot right now, I still think it's missing something to really push it up into tier 2 status, which is where I think some people think it should be. Next up we have Harpies, and Harpies is a deck that I think has been getting a little bit of hate as of late, and I'm not really sure why. I think Harpies is a good deck, and I again have to stress every time I make one of these tier lists, Tier 1, 2, and 3 are all good decks. All of these decks can win games off of the others. Just the higher up the list we get, the more consistently we're going to see these decks winning. Harpies can take games off of every other deck we've spoken about so far. But a lot of people are quick to throw Harpies under the bus, and I think a big part of this is just because Harpy is very free-to-play friendly, similarly to how Blue Eyes is, which means we see a lot of people playing it on the ladder, and a lot of those players aren't necessarily doing particularly well with the deck, but in tournaments we are seeing this deck doing okay. Overall, Harpies is an okay control-y, aggression-y style deck. is kind of a hybrid deck where it can play this kind of slow, hide behind your traps, flip one monster up each turn, attack in, get some good damage in, play the slow game, or it can go kind of super hyper aggressive, summon out 3 monsters, pump, 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 get as much damage in as you can, and try and kill your opponent that way. So I think it's very versatile. I think the main issue a lot of people have with this deck is that it is not very flashy. It feels almost like the old Thunder deck, where Thunder was still strong, it was okay, but it didn't do anything unfair, it didn't do anything crazy, and the only real crazy thing that this deck does is summon out the maximum, which happens so very rarely, I think most people even forget it can even do that. But Harpies I still think is in a fantastic spot. I think a lot of people think this deck is a lot worse than it is, and I would quite happily still bring this deck to a tournament, to be perfectly honest. And the next deck we're going to talk about is going to be Seven's Axel Road. So Seven's Axel Road Spellcasters is still a good deck. The main issue I think this deck has is that it does kind of suffer from a similar problem that Blue Eyes has, which is there's not really a good way to play this deck without kind of just filling up your board with face-up monsters. And when you do that, you're opening up yourself to get popped by something like the Doom Metal. I think as well, a deck that wants to summon 3 attack position monsters, boost them all up, attack into your opponent, and ideally get as much damage in as possible, are always going to feel a bit weird in the Slime Negate attack meta, where we have basically these 2 Waboku-like effects that prevent us from really taking any damage for 2 turns. All of these kind of all-in attacky decks can feel a little bit outclassed, because if we summon out 3 guys, go into attack, your opponent negate attacks, on the crackback you're now sitting there with 3 relatively weak monsters. They're all going to probably get destroyed, and you're going to take a chunk of damage if you don't have your own Slime and Negate attack ready to protect you. So I think it's in a bit of a weird spot. Again, I think the deck is still strong. I think the deck can definitely still take games off of every single other deck here. I think it's just kind of the worst best deck at the moment, which is a bit of a shame because I've always had a bit of a soft spot for the Spellcasters. And then we will just finish up talking about some more high rogue decks. So obviously we still got the Noodle Ninjas. The next one we're going to talk about is going to be Dragonic Resonance. Dragonic Resonance is still a relatively strong deck. The major issue with this deck is that it has a silly little restriction on it, which says we are not allowed to play non-dragons, which means we can't use things like Esso, and Esso plus Dragius is incredibly strong right now. So because of that, I think aggro is always going to be just better than Dragonic Resonance, but Resonance is still a strong deck. It's still a fine deck. Being able to pop back row is still really, really good. Being able to fix your hand using Bunker Strike is still really, really good. Having access to Dragius is always going to be really, really good. On top of the fact, we still have easy access to getting a 1500 attack double attacker in Twin Edge Dragon plus the skill. So Dragonic Resonance, although it's fallen down from its grace a little bit, I still think is quite a strong deck, and I think it shouldn't, again, be underestimated too much. Then we have Psychic. So we do have some players that are still really trying to make Psychic work, and they have been getting some results. This has seen a couple of top 8s, which is a first for Psychics. I still don't think this deck is as good as any of the decks above it. I think the tier 1, 2, and 3 decks are all a step above Psychic, but it's still good enough to kind of take games sometimes. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you bring Psychics to the World Championship qualifier, but if you really want to and you're only going to play through stage 1 to get the rewards, you could probably do alright with Psychic, to be perfectly honest. It does have a lot of the similar issues as Blue Eyes and as the Seven's Axel Road, where it does have to commit a lot of monsters to board, which again does get stopped by Slime and Negate attack and can get punished by Doom Metal, but overall it's still just kind of fine. And then the last deck we're going to talk about is going to be the Steel Striking Dragon Meta Geass deck. So this deck did okay in a recent event. I don't think even made top 8, but it did get to top 16. It did have a positive record after Swiss, so I thought I'd mention it. It's okay. Being able to attack multiple times is always going to be really valuable. Again, I don't know why you would play this over something like just playing aggro if you really want the double attack, but it is another flavor of that, so we'll mention it anyway. So these are the decks. This is kind of how we've placed them. I think realistically, the best decks I could recommend you play is going to be Machine and Aggro. I think Machine is easy enough to play. There is a little bit of nuance to it, but it's not too much. You're not going to be burnt out trying to play this deck. Realistically, none of these decks are particularly complicated, but some of them are slightly more complicated than others, and always remember that when you're playing in something like a GRF where you have like 72 hours of Endless Ladder, you're really going to want a deck that is very simple to pilot, something where you don't have to think too much about it. And machines are okay. The only thing you really have to think about most of the time is, what am I shuffling back? How many cards am I shuffling back? Do I want to shuffle back 1 card or 3 cards? Do I need to leave something in the graveyard for later? Or do I need to put something into the deck so I have a high chance to draw it? It's all that kind of macro decision. But overall, still very, very powerful. And I think it's going to be a great choice for the ladder. And for similar reasons, I also think aggro. For the most part, everyone's been playing aggro for like 7 months now. So I think a lot of people have already got that kind of ingrained into them. They already have the muscle memory of how to play aggro. Dragius is always going to be really, really powerful, and it can end games really, really quickly, which can be a bonus if you're trying to really get those points really, really quick. So aggro is still always going to be fantastic. Noodles are in a bit of a weird spot. I think the Noodle deck is a little bit slower. It can be a little bit frustrating to play, and it can be frustrating to play against. I don't know if I would outwardly recommend you play kind of trap Noodles, but if you like that kind of deck and you do kind of vibe with it, I think it is still very, very strong and does have lots of very, very positive matchups. The major issue I would have for bringing this is I think this deck's worst matchups are probably the machines and the aggro, and I expect these decks to be extremely popular, which means although Noodle can beat both of these decks, I think it will have a bit of a struggle versus if it was to play any of these other decks, which has quite favourable matchups into. And then there is Cyburst. Cyburst is again a bit of a weird deck. It has this kind of low defense problem, which doesn't matter too much, but we do have a big piercing boy in the meta, and we do have someone that can attack twice and easily attack over those monsters. Cyburst is probably going to be fine. This would probably be the third pick that I would go for. So kind of first I would bring probably the Mirror Innovator, second would be aggro, third would be Cyburst. I think realistically it's going to be get to Yugioh the deck, but you still have the Attribute Hydrons to fall back on, which are still competent boss monsters that you can use to close out games. So still a good pick. I think it would be hard for me to recommend that anyone take Royal Rebels to this event, and the only reason I say that is because 2 of the decks that we have up here are very, very, very strong into Royal Rebels, and it has a pretty weird matchup into the Cyburst as well. So Royal Rebels I still think is a really good deck and still could perform very, very well. I just think if played well, Machines and Noodles both have very, very strong matchups into this deck, and therefore it would have a hard time keeping up if those decks are popular, which we do fully expect at the very least Machines to be. Magnum Overlord, again, I don't think I would really recommend that you play this. Again, it could do really well, and it's still a strong deck, but I think I would rather play some of these other decks. Blue Eyes is a deck that I think a lot of people really like this deck. I think especially for stage 1, Blue Eyes is going to be 100% fine. I think you could climb with Blue Eyes very, very easily. I think even on stage 2, because I don't think Royal Rebels is going to be particularly popular, I think Blue Eyes will be a lot stronger, and it does actually have quite good matchups into a lot of the decks above it. So Blue Eyes could be a really strong sleeper hit for stage 2. Then there's Harpies, which is another weird one. I think, again, this deck will be fine for both stage 1 and stage 2. I think it's maybe going to be a bit awkward because I think it doesn't have particularly good matchups into any of the decks above it, but it's still a strong deck. It's still like, even when it has a bad matchup into a deck, I don't think the matchup is ever lower than like 40-60. So even though it is worse against some of these decks, it's still good enough to beat them a decent chunk of the time, so I still think that would be fine. And I don't think I would recommend 7's Axel Road. 7's Axel Road can be quite simple to play if kind of you already know the lines, but outside of it being quite easy, I do think it does get countered by a lot of the decks above it, so I don't know if I could really recommend anyone play this. And all of the high rogue decks, I couldn't recommend anyone try these decks. Again, I'm not saying you couldn't do well with them. What I am saying is that you will struggle more than you necessarily have to if you would play one of these decks instead of just one of the higher tier decks. So again, my top recommendation is always going to be the Machines, but I do expect Machines to be the most popular deck anyway, so maybe if you play something that counters the Machines, you could do quite well, and I think the best options for that is probably going to be the Aggro and the Blue Eyes. So I think I would probably recommend in order the Machines, the Aggro, probably the Cyburst after that, then the Blue Eyes, and then maybe the Harpies. I think those would be the decks in order that I would think about taking. Now, obviously, I am a big Noodle player, so I'd probably just play this anyway. But again, just because I would do it doesn't necessarily mean you should. So this is the list, and that is the order that I would take the decks in. Hopefully, this helped you out at least a little bit and help you decide what deck to take or what deck to build ready for the upcoming World Championship qualifier. Thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.